and welcome to Geopolitical Future's latest podcast episode. My name is Caroline Rose. I'm a Middle East analyst here at GPF. With me today is the GPF Ultimate Dream Team when it comes to the region. First, there's the founder and the CEO of Geopolitical Futures, George Friedman. We also have Hilal Khashan, one of the world's leading experts on Hezbollah and Middle Eastern politics. So thank you for you both for being here today. And we are going to make sense a bit of this chaos that has been going on about Iran. So let's take a few steps back into the whirlwind of the news that we've had over the past few days. And let's go back to the origin of escalation. The U.S. attack on General Soleimani. What was the U.S. logic behind this attack? Why this person? And particularly, why now?
Well, the United States is deeply concerned about the Iranian sphere of influence, the Shiite crescent. They have been putting pressure on Iran financially through sanctions, and they've also been in various ways moving in Iraq and Syria, in Lebanon as well, to try to reshape the Iranian position. The Iranians were responding. They had to respond, and they responded in their strongest place outside of Lebanon, which was Iraq. And in the course of this, the United States began air campaign against Iranian assets. And then at some point, they discovered that the head of Al-Quds, Soleimani, was in Baghdad or near Baghdad. And then a decision had to be made. And in the context of the American pressure from Iran, the American counter pressure, limiting the person who was not the head of the Iranian army, that's not true. He was the head of the Al-Quds force, and therefore the head of one of the intelligence bodies, and also what we would call the terror organization, that he was there. And eliminating him seemed to be, at the moment, possible to destabilize Al-Quds, which was an American goal. And so they did.
Well, I think the U.S., if the intention of the U.S. is to neutralize or weaken Iranian's regional hold, I think the move against Qasem Soleimani is a bit too late. In fact, one can easily say that the U.S. contributed to empowering Iran after 2003. Now, killing one here and one there, a few air raids will not do the trick. So I don't really think the U.S. will be successful in its aim, at least in the foreseeable future, to weaken Iran. Sanctions don't cause a political system to erode and to collapse. And I think the Iranians will continue to attempt to spread their influence in the region. If they are able to spread it further, may be difficult, but I don't think the U.S. is in a position to eliminate Iranian influence in the region.
That brings me to our next question, which is, what can we expect from Iran next? The United States conducted a very, high stakes attack, a strike on Soleimani, cutting out a key leader in the Al-Quds force. Now, the question is, can Iran execute a proportional attack? And is it within their is it within their national interest to do so? So what does the roadmap look like for U.S.-Iranian relations from this point on?
I regard these sanctions in a different way than Hilal does. From my point of view, we've seen substantial unrest in Iran concerning the regime, with massive arrests and releases and the regime trying to find balance. Mostly sanctions don't work, but if your economy is heavily based on the export of oil and a few other things, it can. And certainly you can see from things that have been said by the leadership, there is concern. The problem that killing creates is that it gives a rallying point inside of Iran to national solidarity. So at this moment, however the population or segment of the population regards the regime as incompetent, at this moment the national honor has been hit, and as in the United States or any other country, they will rally. The problem is that this is a declining effect. So yes, they rally now. 3 weeks from now, the price of eggs goes through the roof, and suddenly you have a different dynamic going on. The problem that Iran has is that it must break the sanctions. And to break the sanctions, it must break the willingness of countries like Germany, what have you, to participate. It's not just the United States. If they have a terrorist attack outside of an attack on a military target, perhaps, this would solidify. If they don't respond, they have a domestic crisis. I don't know that the American president, had this complexity in mind when he ordered the attack, but they've created a classic problem. If we do nothing, our domestic support begins to erode. If we do something, then the entire structure of the sanctions may be reinforced. They are very. So it puts Iran in a difficult position. So they've had their demonstrations. They will have a burial. They will do these things, and the moment will pass. So the question is not what they do now; it's what to do later. And in the meantime, as they are not sure what to do, the position in Iraq, where they do have many enemies, will shift. We don't know how. The Israelis will continue to bomb them in Syria. And Lebanon is always the question of if and when something destabilizes, except at this point, Hezbollah is as much part of Lebanese society as a tool of Iran. It's hard for them to distinguish between the two. So I would argue that, in fact, we have, I think, unintentionally placed Iran in a difficult place. But Iran always surprises with their way out.
Yeah, I agree to an extent in that the United States either intentionally or unintentionally boxed in Iran to a very unique position where essentially what they're facing is saving credibility among many of their Shia paramilitaries and militias in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. And at the same time, the real question is, can they afford to escalate tensions further? Can they afford to have a similar, comparable response? And whether the United States did this on purpose or whether they didn't, that I don't necessarily think is the question. But really, the question is that, Iran may not be able to afford a comparable escalatory response to the U.S. I think we definitely can see missile strikes, much of the same, like you said, what we've been seeing in Lebanon and Syria. However, any kind of response comparable to the Soleimani strike, that's another question.
Iran will respond via her proxies in the Middle East. If the Iranians were to decide to act on their own and avenge the killing of Soleimani, then they might run the risk of squandering their achievements of the past 40 years in the Middle East, and they will not do it. And the Iranians are patient people, and they have years of dealing with pressures. Iran is a country of more than 6,000 years. So they have a deep culture, and they will sleep on it for now and wait until another opportunity might rise for them. And they might not even avenge it because they want to maintain their achievements in the Middle East. Now, speaking of the collapse of the regime because of the policy of containment and sanctions, I don't think it will work in the case of Iran because Iran is an ideological state. When the US started to contain the former Soviet Union, the country collapsed 40 years later. The Iranians will persevere, and they think that all they need to evade the sanctions is to have a change in the White House.
I think the Iranians are very sophisticated about the United States. They've been managing relations with the United States from their point of view very well. The issue that is very hard to quantify is the amount of pressure particularly on the merchants. The merchant class was the one that rose in 1979 when it rose against the Shah. When they rose, the entire thing came apart. There have been reports of unhappiness, particularly over inflation, and particularly the value of the dollar, which is the currency. Now, at a certain point, the country becomes desperate. Under the Shah, they became desperate, but over the pressure and the absurdity of the Shah. In this particular case, the pressure really becomes economic. And it is, whether they break or not, I mean, that's a debate we can have. I think they're closer to that because of the demonstrations that we've seen, but I may be wrong. But what I'd really like to hear from you is when we talk about proxies, the proxy we want to talk about first is Hezbollah. And since you're from Lebanon and know them, what do you make of their position now?
It's difficult for Hezbollah to take action and to avenge the killing of Qasimi. I think, the question is, if Hezbollah were to do something, and hit at American interests worldwide, then everybody will know that Hezbollah behind it, and the Americans will always say it was Iran who prodded them to do it. So even if Hezbollah were to get involved in any reprisal against the killing of Soleimani, I think they would be extremely careful, and they will have to wait before they can manage their strike, because they don't want to implicate Iran or themselves in it. They will do it in a faraway land, and if they do it, I think the attack will measure up to the killing of Soleimani. I think they will get involved in a face-saving attack.
Can we still regard Hezbollah as a proxy for Iran? Is it merely an ally of Iran? Or is it a Lebanese political party? How should we think of Hezbollah now?
Hezbollah is an Iranian creation. Hezbollah is not part of the Lebanese mainstream. Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's chief, always says, I am a proud soldier of the army of the supreme leader of Iran. And now, when former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri was assassinated in 2005, Nasrallah accused Israel of assassinating him, but he did not promise to avenge his killing. Now, 2 days ago, Nasrallah delivered a speech and he said, we will avenge the killing of Soleimani, even though he's Iranian. So Hezbollah's allegiance is to Iran. It is not to Lebanon. And Hezbollah, actually, when it comes to Lebanese affairs, Hezbollah is not interested in Lebanese politics. They always wanted to be left alone. They only became involved in Lebanese politics after the Syrian army pulled out from Lebanon, because the Syrians protected their interest. After the Syrian departure, they decided that the time had come for them to fend for themselves and protect their interests on their own. But they don't like Lebanese politics.
Hezbollah is one of the key players in the region. It has rockets, missiles that can reach Israel. It is facing a very powerful air force and counterstrike capability. The Bekaa Valley is targeted by the Israelis every way possible. So, one of the questions is, we've been talking about Iranian response. What about the Israeli response? Israel is sitting there in the middle of all this. Israel is not passive. It has an interesting domestic political problem that could be solved. Israel, in looking at the American strike, could see this frees us for military action. Now, they have avoided conflict with Hezbollah very carefully since 2006. And with good reason. Hezbollah taught them a lesson. But this is a long time later. So one of the questions we would ask is, we look at this as an American-Iranian interplay. We look at this as involving Iranian proxies. But there are also American proxies in the region. Saudi Arabia, UAE, more allies than proxies perhaps, but still there. Is there any circumstance under which Israel would take this as an excuse to attack Hezbollah, and could they effectively do that?
There is no reason for Israel to strike at Hezbollah right now, unless the situation develops for worse between the US and Iran. Now, Israel has essentially achieved its objectives in Lebanon. Hezbollah would never dare target Israel from Lebanese territory. A few years ago, they tried to target Israel from the Golan Heights. Again, then the Israelis made it very clear that they would not allow them to open a new front from the Golan Heights. If Hezbollah were to harass Israel, the consequences would be dramatic for Hezbollah, and they would lose their achievements of the past 20 years in Lebanon. There is no way Hezbollah would provoke Israel from within Lebanese territory. And speaking of Hezbollah's missiles, yes, Hezbollah has many thousands of missiles. But if we recall the events in 2006, Hezbollah's long-range missiles were ineffective. The Israelis destroyed them before Hezbollah was able to launch them, and most Israeli casualties were inflicted by the Katyushas. So I think Hezbollah's arsenal of missiles is for emphasis and to give Hezbollah the claim that they have become a regional power. But it stands no chance against the Israeli Air Force. Yes, Hezbollah has built its arsenal since 2006, but the Israelis have built it the Israeli Air Force is far more superior today than it was in 2006.
So what becomes interesting is this. Iran has threatened not only the United States, but Israel. They're threatening Tel Aviv and Haifa. These are speeches, but they made the threat. There are reports that the intelligence that the Americans got came from the Israelis. Perhaps yes, perhaps no. Those who know don't talk. Those who talk don't know. Would a likely scenario for Iran be, rather than engage the United States, carry out some sort of attack on Israel, which is in some ways easier to attack? It's there. It's not too far away. Do you see any? I see Israel not going on any alert, so that they don't seem to be worried about it. Do you see a move, or should we ignore what the Iranians said about Tel Aviv and Haifa?
Just to add as well, Saudi Arabia could also be a target in addition to Israel. It's an indirect hit to the United States, but that could be also considered.
I think an attack on Saudi Arabia would invite an immediate American response. Israel, as we all know, is a nuclear power. I read the statements by the Iranians that we will transform Tel Aviv into rubble. No, that's not. They cannot deliver on that. I remember in April 1990, when Israel threatened to attack Iraqi nuclear facilities. Saddam Hussein said, "If they do it, I will destroy half of Israel." He paid very dearly for this statement. So, I don't think the Israelis would take that threat too seriously. And if the Israelis respond, even without having to use nuclear power, the response would be devastating.
So we need to look at the American strategy. The Trump administration made a careful decision not to engage on the ground against the enemy. We saw that in the Persian Gulf tanker situation, where the United States, well, according to reports, Trump called off an attack on Iran at the last moment. We also saw that in response to the bombing of the Saudi Aramco, the Americans made no military response. So the issue here is, and we have to be very sensitive to this, leaving aside the personality of Trump or anything else, Trump has taken the Obama strategy of reducing the footprint, the presence, the aggressiveness in the Middle East, and has taken it to an extreme point where he is terrified of being bogged down as we were in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. So the U.S. is happy to make surgical strikes on various targets, but does not want to get involved in a military action. It has, however, deployed a regiment of Rangers, a whole bunch of the 82nd Airborne, and seemingly to Kuwait, but easily pump into Iraq, I should say. A war between the United States and Iran is hard to imagine. Iran is an enormous country. It has 82 million people. And we've learned that pacifying, we may destroy the army, but pacifying the country is not something that's easy to do. So the question then becomes, we talk immediately about how the Iranians will respond to this. We will assume that the Americans had a follow-on plan on the assumption of, and right now, we all assume that this particular president is incapable of making a plan, yet he acts very cautiously and deliberately. And whatever else you say about him, he cannot be predicted easily. So one of the questions to ask here is not what Iran will do. What will the United States do in the crescent, regardless of what Iran does? How will it push its advantage, if it has one? And second, even more complex, if there is an Iranian strike, will he sit there and do nothing? He did the one thing that he didn't want to do, send a Ranger regiment and the 82nd Airborne into a near combat situation. Now he felt he had to. It could be a demonstration of no consequence. That force is almost big enough to take Baghdad, if there were some tanks there. So the question that we have to ask is, all right, Iran likely will put off an attack, so its hands are clean, they can say it, and attack in some unexpected way. What does the United States do as its next move?
The U.S. has no plans to go to war against Iran. Sending an airborne regiment to the Middle East does not mean that the U.S. is planning to go to war. This is a symbol. I think the U.S. wants to deter Iran and convey to the Iranians that the U.S. is serious about confronting Iran in the event Iran does something rash or uncalculated. The U.S. will never do anything when it comes to Iran other than military Air Force strikes. And I'm absolutely sure that the Iranians will not escalate in the Middle East, neither against Saudi Arabia nor against Israel. If they choose to act in the future, they will do it in a very subtle manner, so that there will be no smoking gun pointed at them.
I want to take a few steps back now, just since we're going to be wrapping up. And let's look at the regional picture. Now, the staff at GPF, we've been saying for quite a few weeks that there's something stirring in the Middle East. There is a dynamic that is being shifted. We are starting to see everything being turned on its axis. And this certainly solidifies that, new strikes on Iran and escalation. We're starting to see some diplomatic fallout as well. Germany is meeting with Russia. Saudi Arabia is trying to get together this coalition. We are seeing new lines of communications and dialogue. What do you see? How do you see new opportunities and new fault lines in the Middle East and in the international community coming out of this strike?
Before the strike, Turkey changed its foreign policy dramatically. It laid claim through an economic zone in the Eastern Mediterranean. It reached an agreement with Libya to share its economic zone so that it had a blocking position throughout the region. It declared that it was going to deploy troops and today, they started deploying. So one of the enormous questions is Turkey. Turkey's policy has been for a very long time to stay out of the Arab world, not to get too deeply caught up. Yes, there are issues with Saudi Arabia. There may be issues with Iraq, but Syria, but don't, it's a terrible place to go. Yet it has shifted its policies in a very small way. When it demanded that the United States leave the Syrian section that was guarding the Kurds and it sent its own troops in. It was a very small move, but it was a significant move. It was going to take control of its border. It was not going to use third parties, and it was indifferent to what anyone said or did. They actually were very careful not to cause massive casualties, but they did it. So you have the elephant of the Middle East, Turkey, suddenly be moving. And this was what we saw first, and saying, this is very strange. So suddenly, Saudi Arabia is the weak hand. Turkey is the strong hand. Iran is struggling for a sphere of influence stretching to the Mediterranean. And the United States is not a good friend of Turkey. Seems strangely indifferent to the fate of Saudi Arabia. In other words, all the things that were true since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, that was going to be a European power imposing itself on the region, first the British, and the French, and the Americans, has gone by the wayside. And to me, a domestic Middle Eastern power, Turkey, has arisen. Now, its power is limited. It's what it can do and what it says it can do are different things, as always the case, but it's behaving differently. And it's very interesting to me that no one in the region has really reacted to the fact that Turkey is behaving differently. The Israelis have argued over the oil rights. The only people who have reacted are the Russians, desperately trying to maintain their friendship with the Turks, but then they have to leave Libya. So we are in the middle of, I think, a systemic shift. It appears to be of one shape, but the region is changing shape from a very solid structure, not warlike, but not unpredictable. So I didn't think I would live to the day that Saudi Arabia is a side issue, but we're there. And I didn't think I would live to the day when Turkey is an active power in North Africa. The changes are extraordinary.
I think Turkey's move in the Eastern Mediterranean, especially with Libya, is defensive. Egypt, Greece, and the Emirates are trying to isolate Turkey in the Middle East. The Emiratis are leading a daily propaganda campaign against Erdogan, and Erdogan feels threatened. The Russians controlled the Turkish presence in Syria. They prevented Turkey from overthrowing Assad, and Erdogan feels that he needs to make an assertive move in the Eastern Mediterranean with the aim of getting the various parties in the region to engage him in diplomacy. I think Erdogan is ready to talk to Egypt and the Emirates, especially that they are not willing so far to talk to him.
And it's interesting too, when you're watching the responses from different governments in the region. Turkey has now positioned itself as a mediator, one of the first within the region to do so. Saudi Arabia, of course, has hosted some dialogue. Pakistan and Afghanistan have even gotten involved in talks. Germany, of course, has offered or invited a few countries to try and have a mediation. But Turkey has positioned itself, and very early on, saying we are willing to mediate between the U.S. and Iran. Regarding Turkey's moves in the Eastern Mediterranean, there has been a little bit of resistance within the Arab League. They decided to pass a resolution condemning very ambiguously foreign intervention in Libya, not Syria. And there has, of course, been a few fits from Egypt and Greece and Cyprus as well, which is, of course, expected. But I think it's worth watching to see how Turkey will handle this relationship between the U.S. and Iran, particularly the fallout, if there is going to be any.
There is one concrete element that this gives Turkey: oil. Turkey is an industrial power and is dependent on oil, which it gets from Azerbaijan and some from Russia. And Azerbaijan is under Russian control to some extent, or at least influenced by the Russians. So from the Turkish point of view, some relationship with Russia is okay. Excessive dependence on Russia has a bad history. It is not ready to come to the United States to ask for, a counterbalance. So it did something very interesting. One of the countries and one of the regions that is full with oil that isn't exploited now for political reasons or for technical reasons is the Eastern Mediterranean and Libya. If Turkey can secure both the waterway and the oil, they are now in a very different economic position and a different political position. So I see the Turkish move as partly a signal, but also partly a very necessary move, because if it doesn't go there, where does it go for oil?
Well, you had a successful talk about the Middle East when you started with Iran and you end up in Turkey. So I just want to wrap this up and thank you both for your insight and making sense of all of this chaos. I'm sure we will see quite a bit more in the few coming weeks. So that's all we have for today. Thank you to our listeners for joining us. We will be continually providing the latest analysis of the situation. If you're interested in learning more about what to expect next in the Middle East and what matters, please check out our website at www.geopoliticalfutures.com. You can find all the latest analyses on US and Iran and other major world events there.